We have got regular members, we've got new members. You're all very welcome. And we are honoured today to have Dr. Grace Lordan with us. Dr. Grace, please call me Grace. And Grace Lordan, for those of you who don't know Grace, is the Associate Professor of Behavioural Science at London School of Economics, which is, it's just one hat that you wear, isn't that right, Grace? You're muted there, Grace. You have unmuted yourself, but we still can't hear you. Can anyone else hear Grace? No. Don't worry, Grace, just take your time. You can have a little adjust around there whilst I just tell everybody about your super new book there, Think Big. So this is Grace's new book, literally hot off the press. Take small steps and build the future you want. And it's a lovely practical book. And very much at the start addresses all the different stages that we could be in with our career. It could be that you don't enjoy your job. It could be that you've fallen into your profession. It could be you've failed to launch. Or further on in your career, it could be that you've plateaued, which many people get to that stage. And it might be that you feel that you can't put yourself forward for promotion because you think you're going to be rejected. You know, all of these things are things that we go through in our career. And Grace uses behavioral science to give us a framework to follow where we are thinking big, but we're taking small steps to get to that final place we want to get to. And the structure of the book has 6 sections, really, in which Grace points out that obviously we need a goal. We've got to take steps towards something. So get this well-defined goal that we're going to aim for. We need to take time to take the steps. We need to look inside ourselves. I mean, we've all got biases that stop us from possibly putting ourselves in positions or putting ourselves forward to things. And we have to look outside as well. There's other people who have biases about us that might impact getting the right physical environment, and also, you know, not giving up on your goal, resilience. So, Grace, can we hear you now?
I hope so. Can you hear me?
Fabulous. Fabulous. That's great. That's great. So you're very welcome, Grace. I just sort of stalled there for a minute whilst you sorted yourself out. And I think I'm just going to explain to the members something that I absolutely loved. And I was chatting with Sharon this morning. Sharon, we may have other students of yours here, Grace. I was saying what's so lovely about the structure is that you use your own very personal experience of going through your leaving cert, as we call it here in Ireland, the A-levels, the exams you take 17, 18. What made you think of using that very sort of accessible structure, Grace, to give this advice?
So when I signed the contract with Penguin, they were very excited about having a book on building future that was based on behavioral science. And I have to say, I think the first draft that I gave to them was a book for behavioral scientists. So it was really much more in kind of the structure that you would find familiar if you picked up a book written by behavioral scientists for behavioral scientists. And they basically said, you know, that it needed to become more personable and much more relatable. So I found myself kind of going back and thinking about my own life, actually, and what kind of inspired me to write the book, and putting some of those things into the book. And I will say, I'm usually an extraordinarily private person, so I think a lot of people found it quite weird to kind of read these stories about my life. But I've been getting really nice emails from people kind of saying, "Oh, I identify with that, and I didn't realize that's what the planning fallacy was, and you know, I didn't realize that's what the compromise effect was." But it really was driven by the publisher wanting this to be a book for people on behavioral science, but not people necessarily who were embracing behavioral science.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things very appealing about it, is that you very cleverly weave in the various different behavioral science as if you are sort of teaching the different rules, as it were, or the biases or the heuristics, and it's drawn very cleverly into something that, as you say, anybody could relate to, regardless of their previous knowledge of behavioral science.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted actually a book for people who are trying to figure out what they're doing in the future, but who aren't superhuman. So it's not a book, I mean, I did an interview recently where somebody was saying, I really dive straight in and I'm going to spend, 100% of my time. And I said, look, this book probably isn't for you. This is for kind of the rest of the world who, when we dive in too quickly, we're much more likely to fail. And we tend to be better standing on our tippy toes. So that's kind of who I imagine reading it. And it's everybody from somebody who wants to do slightly different, I think, through a side hustle. So who already has a job and just wants to do something slightly different, to somebody who might be in a career that they don't particularly like, but is nervous to jump, so doesn't want to quit their job, to people who are leaving school and who have no idea what they want to do with the rest of their lives.
And it's very practical, isn't it, Grace, in that, I mean, you've got little bits to fill out in it and tips to analyze yourself. And so how did it come about that you thought, rather than just sort of a talking book, as it were, giving instructions, that you'd really incorporate the tools for the project?
So I think I've gained a lot in life by being quite skeptical about advice that people give me. I incorporate it and I evaluate it. So in the same way that we teach our students to do experiments when they're, rolling out policies at the LSE, that's kind of how I adapt advice that I get. And then I think it would be very hard to write a book where you say, look, here's a bunch of insights that we know had significant average effects in behavioral science studies. But actually, behavioral scientists sometimes overemphasize the fact that something is significant. There is a distribution, which means it mightn't work for you. So you have to go and trial it. And I think only with the exercises are people actually likely to kind of really do that. Otherwise, I think you will find people kind of reading it maybe on the train. They might enjoy it and then they'll actually forget about it. So I'm hoping that interactive part will allow for more, that more longevity, I guess, in the lessons in Think Big.
And the other thing that's very appealing about it, Grace, is that for those of us who didn't quite enjoy our school days, when you describe yourself at school, you seem like you were quite a spunky little creature. You're well able to give yourself back to the teachers, and obviously had very strong beliefs in terms of women's role in society and things like that from quite early on, Grace. So maybe you tell us what young Grace was like.
Well, in some ways, I think what you described is probably the pain for LSE now, rather than the school that I went to in Cork in a lot of ways. But I think, I was somebody who was very badly distracted, to be very honest. So I think teaching me anything was really, really difficult. And the idea of like sitting in a class for an hour where you would have somebody just talk to you about something, really, it doesn't, I didn't like it. And I have to say, when I teach at the LSE normally physically, it's much more discussion based. And I've even found the transition to Zoom has lessened that, which I think is to the detriment of students, because if you are somebody who gets distracted, you do need that kind of discussion base. I think with respect to kind of women in society, I'm not sure when I was younger that I thought so much about the constrained roles of women in society, if I'm very honest. I just think that I wasn't constrained by the stereotype. And I think a lot of that came about from the fact that I went to a school where people traditionally didn't go to university. So there wasn't these conversations about, if you're a woman, you should become a lawyer, but if you're a man, you should become a computer scientist. Like those conversations never happened. So it really surprised me to turn up actually in the university in Cork and there be so few women in the computer science class. It wasn't actually something that I had talked through, but I think I've benefited from that. And I've benefited, in the way that you might actually say, look, it was difficult to be in a school where people traditionally didn't go to university. I think the fact that the social norms weren't imposed on me meant that because I was going to university, I never really factored them in. And I never really thought too much about not being the only woman in the room, actually, until recently, in the last decade or so, when I meet people who are constrained by that, who are kind of constrained about being the only person of a certain type around the table. And it's actually made me really kind of think about it, how do you make people comfortable so they actually stay? So, when I look back in computer science, I mean, there was only 3 of us who actually graduated the degree, actually. And some of them now retrospectively say they didn't feel comfortable in that environment. So in some ways, I mean, I love the way you describe me, and I wish I had been that person who had been championing from a young age. But I just think I benefited from not having the social norms put upon me that other people have had.
And your journey through university wasn't quite straightforward, was it, Grace, in terms of you possibly questioning the subject you were studying?
Yeah, so I mean, when I did computer science, I had this kind of idea that I would be creating graphics for Harry Potter movies, to be honest. And the reality is quite stark. I mean, I like math, but it's a lot of math. And even when I went on co-op and went out working, you were on your own writing code, and you might come together in a small team and make sure that it worked. But there wasn't really so much. There wasn't really so much interaction, and I was really, really blessed, actually, because I was going to quit, and I was really, really blessed for somebody to point out that you can actually do kind of double degree, essentially. So if there's anyone from Australia or who has experienced the Australian system, where you can kind of study 2 subjects at once, and being able to do economics alongside computer science not only kept me in university, but actually the year I left, the dot-com bubble burst. So I think if you'd been in Harvard in computer science, you still would have gotten a job, but there was very few jobs for people in my local university. But the economics then was kind of this insulation kind of thing. But again, it wasn't something that I'd actually thought through. So I kind of call myself a flawed behavioral scientist in that, like retrospectively, I can see all of the lessons in my life. But when I was going through it, the pitfalls that people have when they, when they fall to biases and heuristics, I can kind of see to myself looking backwards. So again, my decision to do a PhD in economics wasn't something that was well thought out. And, I know Sharon's on the line and she's told a lot about doing her PhD. Mine was just negotiated in a job offer where they wouldn't give me any extra money, but they offered me this free PhD. So I said, why not? So again, it wasn't something that I really, really thought through. And I kind of think if I'd actually thought through my career plan, maybe I would be doing much better in my life today. Who knows? But I think there's learning in that kind of looking backwards as well, to taking account of these kind of accidental opportunities. A lot of people who I meet now are very myopic about where they want to go, and they have one direction and one group of people who they actually speak to. And I think if you kind of come out of that style of thinking and come out of that room and speak to other people who have diverse walks of life, come from different countries, you open up so much opportunity for yourself, and actually life becomes much more fun.
And for those of us who are rather rebellious, don't like to be told that we can't do things, and straight away that makes us say, well, I'm bloody going to do it anyway. Grace, maybe you'd share with our members the experience that you talk about in the book of a certain professor who maybe questioned your choice of direction, Grace.
Yeah, so I mean, when I arrived at LSE, I very quickly kind of made friends and was mentored by this quite senior professor and we got on extraordinarily well. And at the time I was planning on being, we had a slightly different career track then, planning on being a senior lecturer, which no longer exists, within 2 years. And I think the interesting thing about this is that I wasn't planning an accelerated career. It would have been just about average had I hit that kind of the two-year goal. And when I spoke to him about it, he essentially said, look, I don't think this is for you. It will take you at least 5 years, and it's probably going to be longer. And what I don't say in the book, actually, which was in an earlier version, is that he did actually point to someone else and say, look, that guy, he's doing wonderful. So that's the person who you should be like. And that relativity really kind of struck a chord with me, and it set me back. I mean, I believed him because it was said also in a very, very nice way, and almost with compassion. So I really, really believed him. And I just started living kind of down to his expectations. So kind of the backwards self-fulfilling prophecy that you might actually want at that stage in your career. And, some time went on, and it was a few months before, and I say in the book, which was absolutely true, I was having a sleepless night about it, thinking, what would I do now? And actually thinking about maybe I should go back to computer science. And I just said, maybe he got it wrong. When I was in Australia, people used to tell me that I was really, really good. I haven't talked to anybody else really at the LSE. Maybe he got it wrong. So I looked for 3 people because I think I'm always a statistician at heart, and we always say three's a trend. So if three people say something is true, then you should probably start believing it. But I also chose three people who didn't know each other, so they weren't connected. So if you're a statistician, that the independence is really, really important. And actually, all of them were very, very optimistic, much more optimistic than he was. And ever since then, when I get feedback that I don't see myself in, rather than react to it, I do get second, third, and fourth opinions. Sometimes I get critical feedback and I do see myself in it. And I think that's important for us. But equally, if I think about the kind of time that I wasted, and actually the happiness, for people who care about happiness, how unhappy I was with that advice and thinking about my trajectory, having that kind of boardroom, as they would put it, if we were in a corporate company today, of people who you can go to, who you can talk to for advice, who have your best interest at heart, I think is the first thing, but who are also critical. Because you definitely want to avoid confirmation bias. And I think too many of us fall into the trap of speaking to people who just tell us we're wonderful and validate our beliefs and tell us that we're right to being upset. So you don't want that either. So this kind of idea of having this kind of independent, and I have to say I'm lucky now that I know so many people, it's much more than three that I can kind of go to for advice. But always, if I'm seeking second, third, and fourth opinions, I look for different perspectives.
And working in an academic environment, Grace, maybe you'd share with us how you have sort of adapted and how work has changed for you over the past year.
You mean from writing the book?
More in terms of actually your work environment. I mean, work is your thing that you write about, and obviously everybody's work has changed. So for you personally, over this year, this year of COVID, how has your work personally changed?
Well, it was interesting. So COVID came in March, and I was the director of the Masters in Behavioral Science then, and it was the first year. And the students were really disappointed. So they had really loved kind of the in-person type lectures. So I think when the lockdown came, we tried extraordinarily hard, and it succeeded. I mean, the MSc in Behavioral Science was the second highest ranked of all MSc degrees across the LSE last year, which I was really proud of. And I think that really came down to time in two ways, getting people together, but I think one-on-one time became really important for those students. And then I went on sabbatical. And I think the interesting thing about being on sabbatical is, people have said to me, it's the worst time to take your sabbatical because it's during COVID-19 and obviously I can't travel anywhere. But I am lucky that I have an 18-month sabbatical, so I think I'm going to get to see some of the world later on. But it has been incredibly good for opening up, speaking to people in other countries. So I've ended up connecting a lot with people in the US and also with Asia over this period, to the point in time where if you met me kind of 3 months ago, I was actually exhausted because I was getting up at 5 to have meetings in Asia. And then I was going to bed really, really late to talk to the West Coast in the US. But that's been extraordinary because, and I've met people outside university as well, and they never would have paid for me, even if they were putting me in economy, to fly over probably to talk to them for an hour. And now you get to hop on a Zoom and have those conversations. I won't lie and say that I've missed the personal interactions. So I think if I could do this book club in person, or if I could have done some of my launch events in person, it would have been much better. But I think on the whole, for me, if I think about productivity and work-wise, I've managed to kind of at least prevail, but definitely open up myself to kind of more global friendships and more global collaborations than I have in the past. I think had I been still teaching, had I not been on sabbatical, I think I would have probably found it much more difficult, because the students who I was able to kind of see through the COVID last year, they had been with me up to the start of March. So we had kind of really good friendships, and I knew them as a group. So I would see them after class and we would, have coffee and things together. Whereas I think building that from October would have been much more difficult. And I think that the team at the LSE have succeeded, but I think I would have found that hard. I like the physical contact with students.
And for any of you who don't already subscribe, the LSE has a fantastic subscription for LSE events covering the whole gamut of subjects that are studied in the university. They're free to register to, fantastic credibility of speakers. So Grace, Thank you very much for the introduction and letting everybody know the gist of the book. And what I'm going to do now is, everybody knows the format by now. I'm going to just hand over to my co-host, to Prakash, who has a question for you himself. And then what we do is we open up to the members who signed in to bring forward their questions. So I'll just hand over to Prakash. Thanks very much, Grace.
I will say that I did suffer from optimism bias in the LSE public events, because I've arranged what we call the world in behavioral science in a post-COVID world. And I started actually those in April last year when I was convinced COVID would be over. Then September, I did another one when I was convinced COVID would be over. And I did try to call the last one, Is It Over Yet? But LSE public events said that we had to have a serious title on the event. So we're going to be doing another one in September, and hopefully it will be over. But given that I've said it so many times, I could actually be incredibly wrong. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise. Thank you, Grace, for being with us. I also see there are a few new members today. I quickly want to give a shout out to them. It is, I think, Sunil, Hedel, Serena, Dhriti, and Justina. I think it's one of the first times you guys are here. Our format is quite simple. I know we are talking mid-session, but we are very informal out here. We go on typically a video on Zoom with a grid view, so that we can see each other's faces and become friends. We're totally cool with exchanging our LinkedIn information with each other and connect, and then have separate Zoom calls with each other, in the following week. That's the whole idea of this club. We want to know Grace and her work and our book. And we also want to make new friends, so that next week, we have something more to look forward to, right? So guys, feel free to do that. Grace, thank you so much for being with us. Unfortunately, this is one of those times when I was not able to get my hands on the book beforehand, and I could not go through it in depth. But I do know that you're covering 6 very important areas, in terms of the time, in terms of goal planning, in terms of resilience, self-narratives, other people, and your environment. And the self-narrative part was the one where I was kind of hoping to get a little more information about what it really means. Most of the time, we know from statistics that coincidence is just that, or seeing a sign. What do you call seeing a sign? It is just something which you are saying it is meant for me. And so from that point of view, there is a narrative bias where you are the storyteller and you're trying to find too much meaning in it. And so one way to look at it is to say, well, these are just coincidences. They just happen. I'm trying to find meaning in it. And on the other side is some sort of a magical thinking where you want to believe you're special. And you can have that conversation with yourself and say, well, I think this is happening to me because of a reason, right? And so I'm curious, where does this part about narrative ties out in the large picture about how do you go about think big, how do you crack it, how do you go from here to tomorrow, let's say. And there are people out here who want to be writers too, right? So how do we do that?
Oh, so I think how I encourage people to think big is quite different to what you might have seen in books before. So I don't encourage people to in the title, you might imagine that you're going to be kind of dreaming big and saying, that's for me and now I'm going to go get it, which is quite different to what I actually believe is the best course of action for choosing careers. So I encourage people to think about the activities that they actually enjoy doing, activities that they would actually like to do for work, and think about the skills that they need in order to engage in the activities. And then think about occupations with those in mind. So instead of saying, I want to be a professor at the LSE, or instead of saying, I want to be a movie producer, or I want to be a nurse, actually thinking about this in terms of activities. And there's a few reasons why I say that. So I think the first is that if you're going to be practicing something that you actually enjoy doing, you're much more likely to stick to it. And I come from the LSE, and people will say you're also likely to be happier. I'm not a happiness economist, so I usually just leave at the fact that you're much more likely to have a habit, but happiness is also important. But I think the second is that it actually makes you much more resilient. So I think too many of us actually have a really bad idea about what we're actually good at with respect to tasks and what are the skills that we actually have. And I speak a lot to adults who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And if you ask them to talk about the activities that they're good at and the skills, they'll often start naming job titles, or start naming function titles, which isn't really going to help you if your industry has actually fallen away. With respect to writing, I mean, I came at writing without having any network actually at all. And I've always wanted to write a book, which was a fiction book that I wanted to write, which might still happen at some point in the future. But to write a fiction book, you have to write the whole book before they'll take you on. I don't know if you know that. But to write nonfiction, all you write is an outline. You write down who you think might actually read it, and you write 1 or 2 sample chapters. So for Think Big, I wrote the introduction and I wrote chapter 2. And then you actually need to find an agent to represent you. And you know, I didn't know anybody with this. And Paul Dolan actually gave me the name of his agent, who ignored me, which if Think Big is ever a big, Paul didn't ignore me. Paul tried to get him to answer my emails. The agent ignored me. So if Think Big is ever actually really big, I'll be sending him the royalties receipts. But what I actually did was go to the internet, look in the UK at agents who represent books like me, and I wrote them an email basically saying, I know you represent these authors who do X, Y, and Z. My book is very like those because it does this. Do you want to represent it? And actually, I was really lucky to get a really good response from agents from that tactic, and I would actually recommend it to everybody. And every agent got a different email, so it took time. So I didn't just say, you know, here's my piece of work, can you read it and represent me? I really made it fit to them and tried to make it easy for them to sell it. And then when we went out to publishers, the hit rate wasn't actually as high, but Penguin came back really quickly and said that they really wanted to represent the book. And then others did come back. It was actually really interesting. So others did come back when my agent Michael wrote and said, you know, Penguin are going to pick this up. Do you want to reconsider? And I stuck with Penguin because I kind of thought actually the person who I want to publish this book is the person who actually saw that it was good without needing someone else to say that it was actually vetted. So the biggest hurdle for me was the agent part. And I think if you get your agent right, then it becomes much easier. But writing the good chapters obviously is also important as well, so that when they read it, they say there's something in here for me.
That's crazily powerful. I had no idea about this, Grace. I don't think a couple of us out here who have planned to write our books, I don't know if they knew this. I had no idea. All you needed. I'm not trying to make it simple. I know it has its own process.
You should. It's much easier than, I mean, in honesty, I would be talking to a different book group today if fiction would take, you know, an outline and a couple of sample chapters. And in some ways, it's easier for me to write this kind of book because I've been working on it for a while, and it's very hard to write fiction. So I don't want to downplay that. But I think that the sunk cost is definitely lower if you're trying to get a nonfiction book picked up.
I do know about this group called the NaNoWriMo or something like that, a national book writing month. It is 30 days where you come together and attempt to write an entire book in November, I think in 30 days. And that was a very interesting thing to realize that, you know, there are groups which are doing that. Just out of curiosity, for people who thinks of the world in terms of numbers, how long did it take for you to kind of write down this book, Grace?
Well, just like Think Big. So, I mean, one of the biggest messages in Think Big is that we shouldn't be trying to do things in 30 days that shouldn't be done in 30 days, you know, and I really believe that. So I believe it kind of for 2 reasons. So firstly, I think it sets us up for failure. I think secondly, it's hard to write something that's really good in 30 days, right? Because the process of actually writing an entire book is very long. Think Big, the outline that I just described took me 3 months to write. And then the book itself, me writing it as a single person before the editor got involved, was about another 9 months. And then there was about another 6 months of an editing process. So remember, I said in the beginning when I was talking to Louise that they basically kind of said, look, your book is wonderful, but it's for behavioral scientists who are this small. The bigger circle is actually the rest of the world. So why don't you go and try and speak to some of those people as well? And that then took another kind of 6 months or so. So I think kind of, especially if you're a new author, you're going to need kind of more of the editing part. I think it's going to be 2 years from start to finish, to be honest. So 2 years from when you meet your agent, because there is kind of this kind of negotiation phase, to when you are expecting to see it in print. And that kind of maps really with my experience. Had my book been published in January when it was meant to, but it was pushed to March because of COVID. So I'm kind of 2 years, 2 months. But it didn't feel excessive. And again, I think if you're thinking about writing, allowing yourself that time is probably going to make you much more likely to get the book picked up. And I think you can self-publish, but it's a very hard road, actually, I think, to self-publish. You're reliant really on having networks to get you out in front of people. Whereas if you go through a formal publisher, they will do all that marketing for you, which is quite helpful.
Thank you so much. So I guess for people who are very, very curious out here, 3 months, just get your format ready, and please get your questions ready out here. We're going to be passing them one by one to Grace out here. And as the questions keep up coming, one last question out here, Grace. I noticed you talked about people who have a certain seniority into their job, not realizing what they're good at, what they love. And over the last few days, I've been interacting with younger folks, people who have just about getting done with their degree in behavioral sciences. And an observation that I've had, and I know it's a small sample size, it was not a research, it was just interacting with them, but it just felt that the younger folks these days, they seem to be much more clearer about what they want. And you're talking about think big, you're talking about planning, you're talking about life and all the different elements out there. Have you seen an observation similar, saying the newer, younger generation seems to be much more clear, much more focused, or this is just?
So my experience at the LSE is I think the younger generation are more information seeking. So they'll ask questions like, what kind of jobs can I do as a behavioral scientist? Where can I end up working? What does it mean to have a PhD? So they're very inquisitive. And I think that allows them then actually to kind of figure out what they might like and what they might not necessarily like. But I think it's through that function more than it being natural, kind of natural to them. So I think we have a generation now who just kind of ask for the information that they need. But I still see among people who are studying master's subjects, whether it's in our own department or in the economics department or in public policy, kind of the 3 departments that I speak to relatively regularly, that people do almost over-focus still on the job label that they want to have. So for example, and even the question that you asked me is it actually kind of speaks a bit to that, the idea of, I want to be an author, how long does it take? If you were taking the activities approach would be, okay, you managed to publish a book. What are the different activities that you had to do to be a successful author? And, did you enjoy doing some of them? Did you not enjoy doing some of them? How long can you actually kind of sit and write for? And I think people who ask those questions then have a much more realistic picture about whether or not actually writing a book is for them. So often when people come to me for career advice, I'll start suggesting that they ask different questions to what they're asking already. So, if somebody comes to me and says, I want to be a behavioral scientist in Goldman Sachs, I kind of say, what do you think? Well, what do you think you're going to be doing in Goldman Sachs as a behavioral scientist? Would you actually enjoy it? And if they kind of say, look, I don't know, I will say, okay, here's a couple of examples of people who apply behavioral science in Goldman Sachs. Do you think you'd like their day-to-day job? And then that makes it actually easier to match. So I don't think that we're there yet, actually. I sometimes do feel that people ask the wrong questions with respect to, because we ask the question with the outcome in mind rather than the process in mind. And it's actually engaging in the process is where our happiness comes from and where our potential to stick actually comes from.
Thank you so much, Grace, for the answer. All of them. I think, Louise, we can do the honors. A lot of questions out here, Louise. You want to help us?
Thanks very much. Yeah, just good flood of questions coming in, Grace. And just before we do kick off with the questions, if you can just indulge me in sort of more of a philosophical question, I suppose, Grace, but the fact that you're sort of specializing in the job world, as it were. My question's more to do with, have you ever sort of questioned the whole concept of sort of the working world, as it were, and the way that we do all drive ourselves into, well, what am I going to do? What's my job going to be? And, that whole sort of bigger philosophical question.
It's a great question. I've thought about it from the other angle. So how I ended up writing Think Big is that I do a lot of work with companies, and I give presentations on the lessons from behavioral science companies sometimes. And I would show up and I would do this hour presentation, and people are interested typically in behavioral science, but the younger people would say to me, look, I actually have no power in this organization. All of your conclusions are from the company's perspective. So I would say, this is what the firm can do in order to have more productive employees that will happen to be happier, for example. And those talks made me think a lot about the type of cultures that we've put around jobs that needn't necessarily be there. I mean, COVID has been a really interesting thing for me, because jobs that they told me, because most of my research is in financial services, and jobs that they told me could not be done flexibly in financial services managed to be done flexibly. For example, front office trading managed to be done from home for people who never had said that they would be able to do it before. So then you need to think about the kind of culture that actually wraps around it. So what I'm really interested in, Louise, is disentangling the activities that need to be done for a job from cultures that have been constructed that aren't particularly pleasant for people. And I think the way you're coming at it is almost thinking about, if I'm an individual, do I question the way that I just enter the occupation? So again, my perspective has been from the firm level, more than the individual. It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, when I kind of think about the world of work, and I've been involved in some conversations recently about the idea of kind of a minimum basic income and embracing the idea that a larger proportion of jobs is going to be automated. But of course, we know that people's identity is wrapped up in work. And part of what I'm hoping to do over the next decade is shift the idea that we wrap our identity up in an occupation title rather than the activities. And I think your question is almost one step further. Why do we wrap our identity up in being able to work at all? So now that you've raised it, I would think about it. Maybe I'm a capitalist at heart. I just assume that everybody should go to work, but I do want them to actually be engaged and I'm productive and happy when they're there. But it's a great question. But I think equally we need to question jobs and how they're constructed. And, as an economist, there's a lot written about the atmosphere that economists actually find themselves in when they go to work every day, not necessarily being very pleasant for women, for example. And you ask the questions, why is that? And then when you look at some of the things that aren't pleasant for women, actually, if you strip down those barriers, that job will become more pleasant for men as well. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why we should be holding that culture. So it's a great question. So I'm kind of going into that, but not from the angle that you want, I think.
Thanks, Grace. Sorry, that was a bit self-indulgent. We've got a whole rack of questions, so I better move on quickly. Joanne, maybe you'd like to jump in there now. You're talking about the details of how Grace wrote the book.
Yeah, no, hi Grace. That was a great talk, and glad I didn't realise actually that you were from Cork as well, and surprised to hear that you didn't get the nursing and teaching talk and before your leaving cert, but perhaps we're from a different era, I think. But yeah, no, I was just wondering what aspects, a specific example of what you left out from your original draft that wasn't applicable to the Think Big book, your final draft. Just to, just as an example of something from behavioral science that you didn't think that the general public, it wouldn't be a goer.
I didn't leave out anything big from the original draft. What happened was the language became much simpler within the draft. And, I tended to describe papers in like these kind of big paragraphs where I would say, this is what happened in the paper. This was the number of people who were the participants. This was the effect. This was the significance. And, over and over again, they would say to me, look, put it in the footnotes, put it in the back. So if you look in the back, it's very heavily referenced for that actual reason. So that was the first big change. And I think the second big change was using narrative actually a lot more. So in the book, I use a lot of my own narratives from my own experience, thinking back about when the particular biases affected me. But I also use the narratives of real people that I've actually met and have been involved in their careers at one point or another. And I think it really kind of speaks to the fact that if we're trying to learn something very complex, which behavioral science is actually, so if we're trying to learn this kind of really kind of complex part, what they didn't want me doing, which I did in the beginning, was talk about the fact, look, anytime you read a behavioral scientist paper, regardless of how confident they write the paper, they're talking about average effects. These are noisy, it's particular samples, there are limitations. So given that we don't know how these things replicate, it's up to you as the individual to take that on board. And rather than talk about it in terms of standard deviations and kind of coefficients and effect size, it really just became a narrative. So I would kind of come up with a story that told the concept that I needed to have. And that is really how it changed. The other chapter that changed a lot from when I wrote it to when it went on is chapter 5, which talks about the biases of other people that can actually hold you back. So the obstacles that you actually encounter. So at the LSE, I run a research centre called the Inclusion Initiative. And, you know, life is hard for some people. You know, they get discriminated against. There's prejudice out in the world. You know, there's cronyism. And some of this is actually driven by, you know, conscious effect, and some of it is driven by unconscious effect. So when I wrote the chapter, I think my editor, I've had 2 editors in Penguin because Jack actually left. We still work together, but on something different. But Jack wrote to me and said, it's a really depressing chapter. So you've talked to everybody about how they can kind of solve their own biases. And now you're saying, well, you're going to do all this work on yourself. And there's all these people who are out in the world who are going to hold you back. You know, you need to really kind of give people hope through the chapter. So if you read the book, I ran out of insight. So the 10th insight is basically saying, look, you're going to have sometimes obstacles that I can't cover in this chapter. If you do, send me an email and we'll have a conversation and we'll figure it out together if you find yourself on your own. Because I didn't want it to be that people were coming out of that chapter saying, well, I may as well give up reading because this is the part of my journey that's going to be the worst. So that I found the hardest, I have to say, writing that one. And it changed a lot. That I think it's much more hopeful now. But it's still quite frank about the fact that these obstacles are actually there. I mean, there's no other way for me to say that the evidence suggests that if you don't look like the type of person who's doing a job, that you need to be, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times more qualified sometimes in order to get over that. And you have to tell people that because at the moment it's true. But I think that there's still kind of life hacks that we can do to actually get around that. And those are the things that went into the book.
Thank you. That's really interesting, Grace. As you say, life hacks to get around some of the obstacles that are sometimes sounds very hopeful. And I look forward to reading your book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanne. And Rachel, would you like to come in with your question now?
Yes, please. Thank you. I saw that Penguin have made quite a big thing of the whole kind of imposter syndrome in the Amazon sort of setup of the book. And I wondered if you could talk around that a little bit with regards to the behavioral science sort of angle of imposter syndrome. And also, this might be my lack of understanding of it, but how is it different to just lack of confidence in yourself in the professional arena?
So, I mean, this is a really great question. So I wrote a piece for Grazia on this, who were also interested in the imposter syndrome for some reason. So when I think about the imposter syndrome, you can imagine somebody who has all of the kind of different accolades that they have, and they're sitting in a particular room, and they look around and they don't feel that they actually belong there, regardless of the fact that all of the evidence suggests that they should. So if you or I were to look at them and kind of look at their credentials, we wouldn't make that judgment, but they feel that judgment is part of that. So to speak to the last part of your question, you can think about it as a special type of a lack of confidence. But there's other reasons why we would have lack of confidence as well. So it's a special type of lack of confidence where you think that actually you're not able for the job, you're not the person for the job, you don't necessarily deserve to be there. And I think, I mean, there's a number of kind of behavioral science insights that can help people to overcome imposter syndrome. And I think you'll know that you're suffering from imposter syndrome if you hear narratives. So in Think Big, I talk a lot about narratives in chapter 2, the idea that, you know, people will have this narrative that they're not good enough, that they shouldn't actually be in a room. And I think if you're a very self-reflective person, battling those narratives can be can be actually very effective. So there's another book by Mo Gaudat, who is the CBO of Google, and he writes on happiness. And he talks about the fact that if he's having these negative thoughts, where he'll just say to himself, you know, give me another thought, I don't believe it. So you could imagine yourself being in this room saying, look, you're hearing, oh my God, I don't belong here, that person's better than me. And you just say, okay, that's a lovely thought, give me another thought, give me another thought. And that really aligns with what you would be taught if you went into CBT, for example, what he's saying. And I speak about that. So I think if you are somebody who is self-reflexive and can do those battles, then you should absolutely do them. I think some people find that really hard because, you know, your narratives will catch you at a low ebb, for example. So it's not, you know, and that's probably the time that you're not going to be able to have the conversation. So the first thing that I would say in imposter syndrome is really embrace this idea of small steps. So if you have a narrative that you're an imposter in a particular situation, think about what are the things that people do who aren't an imposter in that situation, and make a list of those things. And then every day, depending on whether you're a journaler or not, at the end of each day, look to see what you've done in your particular day that shows that you were fantastic, that you added value out to the world. So imagine yourself then in the situation in the room where you're having that conversation with yourself. Bring that disconfirming evidence to mind. So it's essentially say to yourself, okay, yeah, but I did this, and bring that hard data. And people who are much more data driven prefer that. And you don't even necessarily, you don't necessarily need to journal. You can do this at the end of each day and just call these things to mind in the same way that people actually practice gratitude. But I think then that there's another class of people who have imposter syndrome. I have a friend who is amazing, but she really goes through these cycles, and I still can't understand it. But having a hype buddy, so somebody who actually has your best interests at heart. So this can be just, this can be a friend or a partner or somebody in your family who has your best interests at heart, who knows what you're aiming for, but who embraces that part of you as both a strength and a difficulty that you have, and will actually encourage you when you're feeling that way. Is another way to get over it. So I think if you're somebody who feels, okay, look, I'm exhausted from this, I'm sick of battling imposters, I'm sick of writing the list of things that I did today, then having somebody else do it. And this is one of the lessons from behavioral science that I really like. So firstly, our own self-belief is malleable. But secondly, having somebody believe in you that's not yourself can be just as effective as believing in yourself. So having somebody who'll say, Rachel, you did fantastic today. Well done. I've never seen anyone be as good as you. I think is really, really important. So I think those three things. So either being self-reflective and having the battle, making the log disconfirming evidence, or actually finding somebody who'll actually do it for you, who's a hype buddy. And I love the idea of that there being hype buddy clubs or something, that people will actually do it for each other, and kind of that it's actually reciprocal. Because I think it's so important. We all go through phases in our lives where we find things hard. And you've mentioned imposter syndrome, which is somebody who actually has the credentials, who's in a room, who's not necessarily feeling that they're particularly good. But of course, if anybody who's on the call today, if they want to pursue a new goal, it's going to be hard in the beginning. So you'll be feeling like an imposter, rightly so, because you're actually not good at something. I went back and studied finance as a professor at the LSE in the LSE, and I can tell you, when you're studying something that hard and you're finding it hard, it is really, really difficult. And again, having somebody who will just say, you've got it, you're smart, it's going to work out, is something that can really help. So I think that those are the three kind of buckets of insights that we have from behavioral science.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a great question and super advice, Grace. And if all else fails, you can try the power stance. Lean in. Now, I'm not sure if Niluka is still on the call. She's got a very good question. Are you with us, Niluka? Oh, super, Niluka. Thank you very much. Niluka's sounding with enthusiasm. So off you come, Niluka.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Brilliant. So my question was really around, Grace, and firstly, thank you so much for all you've shared so far. Really, really interesting. My question was around, we've spoken a bit about having big goals and how you can manage that, the small steps you can take practically to do that. My question is more around what to do if you have more than one big goal. And I think most people on this call would probably say there are a few things that we want to achieve in life. So what advice would you give in terms of what considerations we should be making as to which goals we should pursue first, and how to prioritize, really, because we can't do everything at one time. It'd be pretty tricky. So just your thoughts on goal prioritization and how you can break down some of those things you want to achieve in life, and some of the methods or tools or frameworks to go about that.
I think it's a really great question. So I think the framework in Think Big is something that can be applied to multiple goals, but I don't recommend that people try to apply it to multiple goals. And I actually say that in the introduction. And the reason is because I think what you want to do is build a habit where you're investing in your future, essentially. So you're investing in a particular goal that you want to actually aim for. And what that goal isn't as important actually as the habit of doing the small steps and learning what it actually means to consistently do small steps that move you towards something. So when I wrote this book, I basically used the framework to write the book, to be honest, a lot of the things that you actually learn in it. And since then I took on some other big goals, but it wasn't before I actually had this habit that every single week, there's one thing that I'm actually aiming for, and I'm going to break that down in small steps. And I'm going to make sure that I'm actually showing up for those small steps and they don't fall off the radar. So if you're like me, you'll tend to start things and quit things all of the time, right? So I'm definitely extraordinarily kind of flawed in that regard. So that habit for me was an extraordinarily important and powerful thing to be able to build in my life, so that I'm going to have, and 90 minutes is what I actually recommend for the big thinking goal at the minimum when you're actually starting off. And then I think if you have these conflicting priorities, once you've nailed the fact that you're actually showing up for one big thinking goal, you can make a decision about whether or not you can fit in the time for another big thinking goal next to it. And I think what drives that is saying to yourself, if I decide to do something else, am I going to be overwhelmed to the point that I'll drop both the balls? Or do I now feel that I'm in a steady state where I can actually carry both of them forward? Because with most things that we actually do in life when we're developing habits, there is a point where we actually kind of go over a hill. So in a sense that, when I was setting up the research center at the LSE, there's so much work, and there's still so much work now, but I know what I'm doing. So it becomes very, very easy. It's a habit. I don't need to really kind of think about it. Whereas when I started that, it did feel like this kind of mountain that I was actually climbing. So I think if you have, let's imagine you have 3 priorities, I would pick the one that's the lowest hanging fruit. So that's kind of confidence building. I would pick the one where you have the clearest vision to how you actually get there, and then put those small steps in place. And 6 months down the line, if you don't feel that you're overwhelmed, if you don't feel that you're so busy that you could actually burst, you could think about adding on something else. I think if you ever do feel that you're so busy that you're actually going to be burst, doing the time audits that I recommend in Think Big is a really kind of eye-opening life exercise, where you realize that you might actually be spending your time on things that don't necessarily serve you well, which again is a way to kind of strip time to put to these other priorities. But if you're starting, doing 5 things at once is probably the easiest way to kind of allow yourself to fail, because you won't be able to develop habits across 5 different priorities. And I think the problem with when we start something and don't finish it is we have this narrative then that we quit and that we fail, which again affects the likelihood that we'll actually move on to another priority. So the kind of simple recipe of small steps, I think, and making those as a habit is the way to go.
It's really interesting because, I mean, there's also that theory as well, isn't there, around, I can't remember exactly what the phrase is, but around failing fast, and potentially the benefits of actually failing and trying again. But it seems to me like what you're saying is actually almost chunking and having a goal like you did with your book, and focusing on that first and then going on to something afterwards is a better way to do it, rather than trying to do everything in parallel. It's just difficult sometimes when you have a few passions that you want to do, to be disciplined and focus in on only one thing.
But so the failing fast is entirely in line with Think Big. So one of the people who's kind of coined the idea of failing fast is Jeff Bezos, and actually reading his new book, Wandering something, I can't think of the title, is really worth reading. But he had this big vision that he wanted to have this bookstore that he would sell to everybody. But where he was failing fast is in the small steps. And I write that in Think Big. So the idea that, for example, he would have had to, get funding, he would have had to meet investors. get out there, do that. These are the small steps that kind of get you to that big thinking goal. So you don't want to be delayed as a perfectionist on the small items, but having this kind of big thing in the future that you're actually aiming for makes you much more likely to succeed. So a really kind of neat example of this are, if you go through a career in a lot of kind of corporate companies, people who are analysts who go in at the bottom become over obsessed with getting their next promotion. So they're myopic and I want to get the next promotion. And the ones that actually will end up in the C-suite and will end up actually doing really pivotal roles for the organizations are the ones who walk in on that day and say, I'm trying to be a managing director. I'm looking at being a manager. I'm looking at the end of the line. So everything that they're actually doing is getting them to that big goal. So for those people, even if they wake up one Saturday morning and they say to themselves, actually, I don't want to be a managing director of Goldman Sachs anymore. I want to be in Google. Because they have all of this experience that's getting themselves to kind of a much further position, it's much easier to transfer. Along their journey, they'll be failing probably much more than the person who's just looking for that first promotion, because the only way to get that, to accelerate that career journey, is to kind of fail on those small steps. So one of the things that I say in Think Big, which I think is really important, is I think we have to move away from labeling outcomes as failures and success and think about the process and the decision making that you actually had along the way in that process to get to that outcome. Because everything we do is a combination of luck and what we actually put in. So our decision making and our effort. You can control what you can control, and that's what you should worry about. Worrying about the bad luck doesn't make sense. So I fully embrace the idea of failing. And I would actually say that if you're on a Think Big journey and you don't find yourself failing, that maybe you're not even stretching yourself too far.
Thank you, Niluka. That's a great question. Thank you so much, Grace.
Appreciate
it's very practical advice we're getting today, isn't it? Sharon, would you like to put your question to Grace about the structure of the book?
Yeah, so thank you, Grace. As you know, I love the book, and thank you for today. I'm learning even more. I guess one question that I had is, given that you've been doing a lot of launch events for the book, so talking to many more people now that have read it, based on the questions that are coming up, is there anything else that you now wish you had included that you didn't?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things that I'll say. So the first is, I talk about the importance of activities rather than kind of job titles and choosing your role. But I wish I put another section in that talks about the damage that we have when our identity is wrapped up in a particular job title. So I think as people who are kind of, if you're early or if you're mid your career, it means you're much less likely to pivot and you're much less likely to see opportunities. And there's research that shows that. But more coming out of the talks, I'm getting a lot of questions from people who are on what they've called, rather than myself, the kind of cliff of retirement. So they're 65 and they're going to retire, and they don't really want, they don't know what to do with themselves, and they don't want to take a job that's actually lower paid. And one of the people who I actually worked with previously, who's in that situation, suggested I write a book called Think Broad for that market where, if you're just about to kind of go into retirement, there's so much that you can do, so much life experience, so many skills that are actually built up. Thinking about a combination of, volunteering, board positions, and some other things that you can actually do and use those skills in a way that doesn't actually damage your ego. So I wish I'd put that in. So I wish I'd had this kind of more thoroughly about the damage that it does for us to become obsessed with kind of titles. And secondly, a specific section for people who it will actually probably be in their best interest in terms of happiness and income to think broadly about the kind of portfolio of activities they might actually do after the cliff.
Thank you, Sharon. Great. Well, that's the book maybe to come next, Grace. It can just be the follow-on. So I think we've time for one more question, and I wonder, Nuala, would you like to ask your question, which is about the practical things of publishing?
Well, I might change it slightly. Hello, Grace.
Nuala.
One is, I know you said that Penguin did a lot of promotion, but I've got to say, I've noticed not just with yourself, but a lot of the other people who've been on this, the responsibility on the author is significant for promotion. Significant. I mean, we've seen it in all of the people who've come on, I think. And it used to be in the early days where the publisher did all the work for you and you just kind of turned up and did a little bit. But it seems that you've had to do a huge amount yourself. So that's question one, is that the case? And secondly, given what you've said about how, you know, your own style versus what the book ended up as, you're right, you wouldn't put economist on the book because it doesn't feel like an economist's book. And yet lots of cute phrases and all the rest, but to what extent do you think your identity has changed or evolved based on that, based on what you ended up writing versus how you see yourself, if that makes sense?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm really proud of the book, that I was written for a kind of a broader audience, and I'm glad that they pushed me to do that. And yeah, so I mean, the creative process was torturous at times, but I'm really glad that I did that. I think on the promotion side, it's really interesting. So you get a publicist who does help you. Penguins has put most of the effort in. So there's a thing called Penguin Connect, which is connected to businesses. And they've done an extraordinary amount of work connecting Think Big to businesses. So I've done a number of kind of business talks where they do these block buys. And then they have organized a lot of kind of podcasts, which I hadn't heard of. So I did something called Deliciously Ella, where I've gotten so many emails about, but I had never heard of her. A very nice woman, but I had never heard of her before I did it. So they do organize all of that part of it. But they did drop some balls. So for example, they didn't, they left it too late to send to the Financial Times to be reviewed in the business book section. So thankfully, the Financial Times have offered me a column which will come out sooner. So we've kind of managed to mitigate that negative thing. But I think overall, given my expectations, they've met them, I think, to be honest. I mean, I've done some more stuff which I was expecting. I'd spoken to a guy, I don't know if you've heard of him, his name is Bruce Daisley. He's written the Joy of Work, and he wrote like a PDF about how you might be disappointed with the amount of publicity that your publisher actually does. So because I had spoken to him and he had told me about that, maybe my anchoring of my expectations, Nuala, was lower than some of the other people that you had on, but they did meet my expectations, to be honest. They did. And you know, we got some great quotes for the book as well, which I was really happy about. But you definitely have to work yourself. You definitely have to kind of work yourself. And my expectation actually is that, well, they said they're going to do another bump in September, to kind of put it out there in September. But my expectation is that if you want longevity in the book, you have to do the work. Most books, somebody told me that 90% of books don't make their advance back or something like that. So it's a huge statistic. And most books come in for a few weeks and then go out. So I think if you can be a book in a growth market, that's a good place to be. But yeah, you can always do more. You can definitely always do more.
Well, that's been fascinating to hear all of the background, Grace, of the book, the actual practical things of putting it together, learning about you yourself as young Grace, and then all of the very hands-on practical advice you've given our members today of how they might like to approach things. So it's been a super session. We really appreciate you joining us today, Grace. All of it. I think everybody loves the phrase, the hype buddy. We'll all be looking for one of those if you haven't already got one. Sharon, by the way, we started off as habit buddies.
Oh, I like that.
To encourage ourselves with the habits we're adopting. Now we just meet for a chat, but it's still very rewarding. I think we just tell each other not to beat each other.
That's not confirmation bias, Louise. I think
we just tell it. Yes, oh yes, we do tell each other we're doing great, and not to beat each other up so much. So anyway, yeah, I can definitely advocate for that kind of support. So thank you very much, Grace. Thank you all of us members for joining us again, and familiar faces and new faces. And I'll just hand back to Prakash, who jumped back in again, and he'll just close the event. Thanks very much, Prakash, and thanks, Grace, and thanks all the members.
Thanks, Louise. It's been really awesome. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic forum, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you, Grace. I have been here, but I've been so sleepy, I told you, because of the long day ahead. I did not wanted to be looking, very tired or uninterested, what Grace was saying. for speaking and giving us all the suggestion. So I had a video off, please don't mind that. All right, I'm just going to put some people on the spotlight. Nuala, number 1, Latija, number 2, Kathleen, number 3. 3 months. That's what Grace has told us. It takes you to kind of put the outline of the book.
Oh,
right?
the book. Ah, okay.
Yeah,
I thought you.
3 months.
Think Big is much longer. Think Big is much longer. Yes, 3 months.
Outline, the first step, 3 months. So end of this quarter, I think we'll have to remind these 3 folks. And if there's somebody else who's planning to write their books, right? 3 months, let's do a checkpoint end of this quarter. Why not? Right?
Yeah.
And, one of the best things that can happen, when Grace is giving us one of our time is it makes people out here who are sitting saying, it turns out into writers. Why not? That'd be fantastic. Why not think big? Thank you so much, Grace. I'm sure the book is phenomenal. I'm waiting for my copy. And thank you for being here with us, taking our questions. For everybody else who joined in, thank you so much. Wear your mask, stay safe. Before we leave, Grace, any parting words? Back to you on that.
No, I always talk about time at the end of every session, because I think that, people squander their time a lot. So I hope people who have actually come today have enjoyed it. And thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And if there's other questions that you want me to answer, do send me an email.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back next week. We have Luca Delana talking about the control heuristic. And Luca is actually our last guest who was in our original roundup for the Nudge Stock speakers, which of course is coming around again very soon. So it will be lovely to speak to Luca next week, and I hope that you will join us. And we'll see you same time next week.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Stay safe.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.